Michael Thorne poured 2 glasses of his wife's most expensive champagne, handed one to the woman who was not his wife, and said with a smile so wide it could break a mirror, "Welcome home, baby. Everything you see, it's ours." He didn't know those 4 words would be the most expensive mistake of his life. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted completely, someone you built your life around, stay with me. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button and follow every single part of this story to the very end. You will not regret it. There is a specific kind of man who believes the world was built for him. Not because he earned it, not because he sacrificed for it, but because for a long time no one ever told him otherwise. Michael Thorne was exactly that kind of man, the kind who walked into a room and immediately calculated what he could take from it, the kind who smiled at you while his hands were already in your pockets, the kind who had learned very early in life that charm was cheaper than honesty and far more effective. He was 43 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of easy confidence that made people assume he was important before he ever opened his mouth. He had a firm handshake, a careful wardrobe, and a way of looking at you that made you feel like you were the only person in the world, right up until the moment he needed something from someone else. Michael Thorne had not built a single thing in his life. What he had done, what he was genuinely talented at, was attaching himself to people who had built things and then slowly, quietly making himself appear essential to their story. And Evelyn Vance had been his greatest achievement. He met her 7 years ago at a technology conference in San Francisco. She was 38 at the time, already the founder and CEO of Ether AI, a company that had spent the previous 4 years rewriting the rules of machine learning in ways that most of the industry was still trying to understand. She was not flashy. She did not stand at the center of conversations demanding attention. She stood slightly to the side, holding a glass of sparkling water, watching everyone else talk. And Michael, who had spent his entire life reading rooms, immediately recognized something in her that he had never seen before. She was the most dangerous person in that room, and he walked straight toward her. Their courtship was a slow, careful performance on his part. He was patient, more patient than he had ever been with anyone, because he understood instinctively that Evelyn Vance was not a woman you could rush. She did not respond to flattery. She responded to precision. So he was precise. He researched her work. He asked intelligent questions. He listened. Actually listened in a way he had never bothered to listen to anyone before. And Evelyn, who had spent her entire adult life surrounded by men who wanted her company, her contacts, or her capital, found herself genuinely surprised by a man who seemed to want only her conversation. She was careful. She told herself she was careful. But even brilliant people have blind spots, and Evelyn's blind spot had always been the same. She found it almost impossible to believe that someone could be performing for her, because she herself had never performed for anyone in her life. She said what she meant. She did what she said. And so, at the deepest level, she could not fully comprehend a person who did neither. They were married 18 months after they met. The wedding was small, deliberate, and documented by exactly 2 photographers and no social media. Evelyn did not believe in public displays. Michael smiled through the entire ceremony and thought about the prenuptial agreement he had signed 3 days earlier and the way his lawyer had called it airtight and aggressive and protective of the wife's assets to an extraordinary degree. Michael had smiled at that too, because Michael had already decided that the prenuptial agreement was simply an obstacle, a legal fiction that he had 5, 10, 20 years to dismantle. He had seen it happen to other wealthy men. Their wives got comfortable, got distracted, got soft. And slowly, over years, the legal walls came down and the money spread itself around more generously. He just had to be patient. So he was patient. For 3 years, Michael Thorne was the perfect husband. He attended every event Evelyn asked him to attend. He charmed every board member, every investor, every visiting dignitary who passed through their social circle. He remembered birthdays and anniversaries and the names of people's children and the specific wines that specific colleagues preferred. He was by every observable metric an asset to his wife's world. And in private, he was warm enough, attentive enough, present enough. Evelyn was not a romantic woman in the traditional sense. She did not need grand gestures or poetic declarations. What she needed was a partner who showed up, who was reliable, who did not create problems she then had to solve. And for 3 years, Michael provided exactly that. She began to trust him. Not completely. Evelyn Vance did not trust anyone completely, but enough. Enough to give him a secondary access card to her executive calendar. Enough to let him attend certain internal meetings at Ether AI when she needed a supportive presence. Enough to occasionally leave her laptop open on the kitchen counter when she stepped away to take a call. Enough. That was the word Michael had been waiting for. He did not begin stealing immediately. He was smarter than that. He spent 4 months simply observing, memorizing the structure of Ether AI's internal systems, understanding who reported to whom, learning the names and access levels of Evelyn's most senior technical team. He watched the flow of information the way a surgeon watches a patient's vital signs, looking for the moment when the system was most open, most relaxed, most vulnerable. And then, in the early spring of that 4th year of their marriage, Michael Thorne made his first contact with a man named Derek Calloway. Derek Calloway was the vice president of strategic development at Cybernetics Group, a technology company that had been trying and failing for the better part of a decade to replicate the kind of machine learning architecture that Evelyn's team had built from the ground up. Cybernetics had money. They had resources. What they did not have was the fundamental intellectual architecture, the proprietary neural network framework that Ether AI had spent 6 years and $900 million developing. And Derek Calloway had been very quietly, very carefully looking for a way to get it. He and Michael met for the first time at a charity golf tournament in Pebble Beach. It appeared entirely accidental. They were placed in the same group by a scheduling algorithm neither of them had touched. They had drinks afterward. They talked about the industry. They said nothing specific, nothing actionable, nothing that could be transcribed into evidence. But by the end of that evening, both men understood exactly what the other one needed, and the negotiation began. Michael was very careful about how he moved. He never used his personal phone. He never accessed Evelyn's systems from inside their home network. He had a separate device, a tablet prepaid purchased with cash from a store 2 counties over that he used exclusively for his communications with Calloway's intermediaries. He met in person whenever possible. He documented nothing. He was in his own estimation brilliant. He was also in his own estimation beginning to feel confined, because here's the thing about men like Michael Thorne: the performance is exhausting. 7 years of being careful, being measured, being good enough. It takes a toll that most people never see, and Michael himself could barely articulate. He wanted to stop performing. He wanted a space where he could simply be himself, careless and selfish and uncomplicated without consequence. Clara Simmons was 26 years old. She worked as a marketing consultant at a firm that had done a campaign for a tech company tangentially connected to Evelyn's orbit. She and Michael met at a product launch event, a crowded room full of noise and canapes and people performing their professional selves, and Clara had laughed at something Michael said, genuinely laughed, and the sound of it hit him somewhere low and dangerous. She was not particularly sophisticated. She was not strategic. She did not calculate. She was simply young and easy and completely entirely focused on him. Within 6 weeks, they were meeting twice a month at a hotel in Palo Alto. Within 3 months, Michael had set up a separate credit card under a business name to cover the expenses. Within 5 months, he had begun telling Clara things he had never told anyone, not because he trusted her, but because he needed a witness to who he actually was, and she was the only one available. "You know what the worst part is?" he told her one evening, lying on the white hotel sheets with his shoes still on. "She doesn't even see me. She sees an asset, a presentable husband-shaped object she takes to events." Clara ran her hand across his arm. "That's so sad," she said. "It is," Michael agreed, and he believed it in that moment completely. He had rewritten his own story so many times that he had lost track of the original. The affair continued. The corporate espionage continued. Michael lived in the narrow corridor between these 2 secret lives and his marriage, and for a long time the walls of that corridor held. Then 6 months in, he made the first small mistake. It was not a dramatic error. It was the kind of mistake that seems insignificant, the kind that in a different marriage with a different woman might have been missed entirely. He left a receipt in his jacket pocket. A hotel receipt from the Palo Alto property for a Friday night when he had told Evelyn he was in Sacramento for a conference, Evelyn found it on a Sunday morning when she was preparing clothes for the dry cleaner. She did not say anything. She stood in the laundry room for 4 minutes and 20 seconds. She counted later because she counted everything, and she looked at the receipt, and she thought with the crystalline clarity that had made her one of the most effective CEOs in Silicon Valley. He is lying to me. He has probably been lying to me for some time. I need to understand the full scope of this before I respond to any part of it. She put the receipt back. She sent the jacket to the dry cleaner, and she began. The first call she made was to a private investigation firm she had researched 18 months earlier, not because she had suspected anything specific at that time, but because Evelyn Vance believed in preparation the way other people believed in prayer. She had identified 3 potential investigative firms, ranked them by reputation and discretion, and filed the information away in a mental folder she hoped she would never need to open. She opened it that Sunday afternoon. The firm was called Meridian Consulting Group. They operated out of a modest office in San Jose, and their work was entirely invisible, no website, no advertising, no digital footprint to speak of. They came recommended by the head of security at a Fortune 50 company who owed Evelyn a quiet favor. She met with their lead investigator, a woman named Patricia Solis, on Monday morning in person at a coffee shop 12 miles from their offices and 20 miles from Ether AI headquarters. "I need to understand what my husband is doing," Evelyn said. "All of it. Not just the personal matters, everything. His communications, his movements, his financial activity, his professional contacts outside of our shared social circle." Patricia Solis, who had been in this business for 22 years, looked at Evelyn Vance across the small table and felt for the first time in a long while a precise and specific kind of respect. "That's a broad scope," Patricia said. "I can afford broad," Evelyn replied. "It'll take time to do properly." "I have time," Evelyn said. "What I don't have is room for error." Patricia nodded slowly. "Then we'll do it properly." "One more thing," Evelyn said, and she set her coffee cup down with the careful precision of a person placing a chess piece. "I don't want him to feel watched. I want him to feel safe, completely safe. I want him to do exactly what he would do if he believed he was invisible." Patricia looked at her for a moment. "That's harder." "I know," Evelyn said. "That's why I'm paying you." She went home that evening and made dinner. She asked Michael about his day. She listened to him talk, watched the easy way the lies came out of him, smooth and automatic, and completely unworried. And she felt something shift inside her chest. Not grief exactly, not quite anger, something colder than both of those. She had spent 7 years building a life with a man who had been performing a character for her benefit from the very first evening they met, and she had never known. That was the part she was having the hardest time with, not the betrayal itself. Evelyn was not naive. She knew the world was full of people who lied, who manipulated, who used charm as a tool and intimacy as a weapon. She had navigated that world for her entire professional life. She had been lied to before, and she had survived it, and she had learned from it. What she could not easily accept was that she had brought one of those people into her home, had stood across from him and made a promise in front of witnesses, had lowered her guard, not fully, not completely, but enough, and been taken anyway. She was furious. She was furious in the way only very controlled people can be furious, entirely on the inside, entirely invisible on the surface, and utterly completely focused. Because Evelyn Vance did not express fury, she converted it. She converted it into action, into planning, into the slow and meticulous construction of something that Michael Thorne would not see coming until it was already done. She called her attorney the next morning. Not her general counsel, her personal attorney, a woman named Dana Cho, who had helped structure Evelyn's personal assets years before the marriage, and who had been the architect of the prenuptial agreement that Michael had signed without reading closely enough. "Dana," Evelyn said, "I need to review the morality clause." There was a brief pause on the line. "The full clause or just the trigger conditions?" "Everything," Evelyn said. "I want to understand exactly what evidence I need to have, in what form, documented in what way before we can activate it." "Evelyn," Dana's voice was careful, "are you telling me—" "I'm not telling you anything yet," Evelyn said. "I'm preparing. Tell me what I need." Dana told her. It was more than Evelyn had hoped for, and less than she needed right now, which meant she had work to do, careful, documented, airtight work. She began. 3 weeks after she had found that hotel receipt, Meridian Consulting Group delivered their first preliminary report. It was 34 pages long. Patricia Solis walked Evelyn through it in a conference room with no windows, the door locked, all phones in a box outside. The personal information, the affair with Clara Simmons, the hotel visits, the unauthorized credit card occupied 11 pages. It was damaging. It was exactly what the morality clause required, and under different circumstances, it would have been enough. But it was pages 12 through 29 that changed everything. "This is the part," Patricia said quietly, setting a series of printed documents on the table between them, "that I want to make sure you're ready to look at." Evelyn looked. She looked for a long time without speaking. The documents traced a series of communications carefully anonymized, routed through relay servers, but ultimately traceable by the digital forensics specialist that Meridian had brought in between a device registered to a prepaid account and a series of intermediaries connected to a man named Derek Calloway at Cybernetics Group. The technical documents that had been transferred were described in a 12-point summary at the bottom of page 22. Evelyn recognized every single one of them. They represented collectively somewhere between 2 and 4 years of Ether AI's most sensitive developmental research, the foundational architecture of the system she had spent the better part of a decade building. "How long?" Evelyn said. Her voice was completely flat. "Based on the earliest communications we can verify," Patricia said carefully, "approximately 9 months." Evelyn sat with that for a moment. "He was at Ether AI events," she said. "He was in meetings. He was in the building." "Yes," Patricia said. "And all of this time—" Evelyn stopped. She placed both hands flat on the table. She breathed. "All right," she said. "I need 2 things from you. First, I need everything. Every piece of evidence you can document formatted in a way that federal investigators can work with directly. Second—" And here Evelyn looked up, and her eyes were so still that Patricia, who had interviewed murder suspects and sat across from sociopaths and never flinched, in 22 years felt a faint chill. "I need you to make sure he feels completely untouched, completely confident. I need him to believe, for the next several weeks, that he has won." Patricia Solis looked at her for a long moment. "You're going to let him walk into it himself," Patricia said. "I'm going to open the door," Evelyn said quietly, "and wait." She drove home that evening and found Michael in the kitchen pouring wine, relaxed, easy smiling at his phone. He looked up when she walked in. "Hey," he said. "Hard day." "Long day," Evelyn said. She set her bag down. She looked at her husband, the man she had married, the man she had trusted, the man who had taken 7 years of her life and used them as cover. And she smiled. "Actually," she said, "I need to fly to London this week. Probably Thursday through Sunday, board meetings." Michael's expression did not change, but his eyes did just for a fraction of a second, just a small, quick calculation running behind them. "That's tough," he said. "I'll miss you." "I know," Evelyn said. She walked upstairs, and Michael stood in the kitchen below, already reaching for his phone. He thought he was planning. He did not know he was walking into the final chapter of a story that Evelyn had already finished writing. The mansion sat at the end of a private road in Atherton, California, 5,000 square feet of stone and glass and silence surrounded by 2 acres of carefully maintained grounds. Michael had lived in it for 4 years. He knew every room, every hallway, every corner of it. Or he believed he did. What Michael had never once thought to verify, because it had never occurred to him that such a thing required verification, was the legal ownership of the property itself. The deed to the Atherton estate was not held in the name of Michael and Evelyn Thorne. It was not held in Evelyn's personal name either. It was held by a private limited liability company called Vance Heritage Holdings, LLC, registered in Delaware, 5 years before their marriage, with a single member and a single owner whose identity was protected by the full force of Delaware's corporate privacy laws. Evelyn Vance, only Evelyn Vance. Michael had no ownership stake in the property, not a fraction of a percentage, not $1. His name appeared nowhere in the chain of title. He was in the strictest legal sense a guest, a resident by permission, a presence tolerated at the discretion of the company's sole member. He did not know this. He had signed documents at closing, as he had signed documents throughout their marriage, casually, quickly, with the confidence of a man who assumed that the details were technicalities, and the power was his by virtue of who he was. His attorney had reviewed the ownership structure. His attorney had explained it to him. Michael had not listened carefully because Michael had been thinking about something else. He had been thinking about the future, about the long game, about how patient he was willing to be. He had been very patient. And now, Evelyn was going to London on Thursday. The house would be empty. He picked up his phone and wrote a message to Clara. "I have a surprise for you this weekend. Pack something nice." She responded in 30 seconds. "I'm already excited." Michael smiled. He thought about how Clara had never seen the mansion, had only heard him describe it in those hotel rooms in Palo Alto, in the specific way he described things he wanted to appear to own. He had talked about it like it was his. The grounds, the wine cellar, the chef's kitchen, the master bedroom with its floor-to-ceiling windows, and its view of the garden. Our house, he had called it more than once. Our house. He poured himself more wine and walked to the window of the kitchen and looked out at the garden in the falling dark, and he felt in that moment the specific pleasure of a man who believes he has arranged everything perfectly. He was already imagining the weekend. He was already imagining the life that came after the divorce, the settlement, whatever portion of Evelyn's empire he could negotiate for himself, the fresh start with Clara, the story he would tell about leaving a cold and emotionally unavailable wife for something real. He had the whole narrative ready. He had just not checked whether the narrative was built on solid ground. It was not. 40 miles away in a hotel room, she was not staying in for pleasure. Evelyn Vance sat at a small desk with her laptop open and 3 separate encrypted communication channels running, and she finalized the last piece of what she had been building for the past 6 weeks. She reviewed the evidence package with Dana Cho via secure video call. She confirmed the call she would be making to the FBI's Cybercrime Division field office, a call that had been arranged 2 weeks ago through channels that had nothing to do with her public profile or her company's legal team. She reviewed the security protocols for the mansion, updated the access logs, and made one final quiet adjustment to the AI-controlled building management system. Then she looked at her phone. She had a message from her head of physical security, a former Secret Service agent named James Carver, who was already in Atherton. "Everything is in place," the message read. He arrived at the property at 8:47 p.m. She arrived at 9:12 p.m. Both vehicles are in the garage. Evelyn read the message. She closed her laptop. She stood up, straightened her jacket, and picked up her keys. She was not flying to London. She had never been flying to London. She was going home. James Carver's message had been precise, as his messages always were. He did not editorialize. He did not add commentary. He simply reported what he observed in the order he observed it with timestamps attached. Michael arrived at 8:47 p.m., Clara at 9:12 p.m. Evelyn read both lines twice, then set her phone face down on the passenger seat of the black SUV she had rented under her assistant's name and pulled out of the hotel parking structure onto the highway heading south toward Atherton. She did not drive fast. She did not need to. She had all the time in the world tonight because for the first time in 6 weeks, the schedule was entirely hers. It had taken 23 days to build what she had built. 23 days of arriving home at normal hours cooking dinner, when it was her turn asking Michael about his week, listening to the answers with the same patient attention she had always given him while underneath that surface, working in the hours before dawn, and in the locked conference rooms of buildings Michael had never visited, she had assembled everything she needed. The evidence package was complete. Dana Cho had reviewed it 4 times. Patricia Solis had certified the chain of custody on every document, every recording, every financial trace. The FBI field office contact, a supervisory special agent named Robert Haynes, whom Evelyn had been quietly briefing for 11 days, had confirmed that what she had provided was sufficient to open a formal criminal investigation. All of it was done. All of it was filed. All that remained was tonight. And tonight, Evelyn told herself, was not about revenge. Revenge was a word for people who needed an audience, What Evelyn needed was closure, a hard, clean, legally documented line drawn between who she had been for the past 7 years and who she was going to be starting tomorrow morning. She merged onto the freeway and let the car do what it was built to do. Inside the mansion, Michael Thorne was feeling something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt free. It was the specific, reckless freedom of a man who believes just for this one night in this one space that he has finally escaped the performance. No careful words to choose, no expressions to manage, no version of himself to maintain. Just the house and Clara and the champagne he had pulled from Evelyn's private collection without a moment's hesitation. He had given Clara the full tour. He had done it the way a man does when he wants someone to understand the size of what he controls, slowly, deliberately pausing in each room long enough for the weight of it to register on her face. He watched her eyes move across the kitchen and the dining room and the sitting room with its original art and its custom furniture, and he felt each widening of her eyes like a small victory. "This is insane," Clara said, standing in the center of the main living area, turning slowly. "Michael, this is actually insane." "It's home," he said simply. She turned to look at him. "How much is it worth?" "Conservatively." He tilted his head. 12 million. Maybe 14 the way the market's been moving. Clara made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a breath. "And she just goes to London, and leaves all of this." "She's always working," Michael said, and the casual ease with which he dismissed his wife, the woman who had actually built everything surrounding them, was so complete, so unself-conscious, that it was almost impressive in its wrongness. "She doesn't even notice what she has." "But you do," Clara said. "I do," Michael agreed. He handed her a glass of champagne. She took it. They stood in the middle of Evelyn's home and touched their glasses together, and the sound of crystal meeting crystal rang out clean and bright in the silent room. It was 9:31 p.m. 40 minutes later, the first thing went wrong for Michael, though he did not recognize it as wrong at the time. He had gone to the kitchen to open a second bottle, and his phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at it out of habit, expecting Clara or possibly one of his relay contacts. It was neither. It was a text from a number he did not recognize, a simple string of digits with no name attached. The message contained 4 words: "Enjoy the house tonight." Michael stared at it for a moment. His first instinct was spam, some automated system, some misdirected message. He almost deleted it. Instead, he set the phone face down and opened the wine. He did not think about the message again for another 2 hours. That was a mistake. In the security monitoring room, a space built into the lower level of the property that Michael had never once entered in 4 years of living there, James Carver sat in front of a bank of screens and watched with the detached professionalism of a man who had spent 15 years protecting people from threats they never saw coming. He had 6 feeds running. Every room Michael and Clara had entered, the kitchen, the dining room, the wine cellar, the master suite. The coverage was complete. The audio was clear. Everything was being recorded to 3 separate encrypted servers, 2 of which were off-site. James sent Evelyn a brief update at 10:07 p.m. Subject and companion in master suite. Relaxed. No indication of awareness. Evelyn replied in under a minute. "I'm 20 minutes out. Hold." James read the message, set his phone on the console beside him, and continued watching the screens with the quiet patience of someone who understood that the most important part of any operation was the waiting. Clara had found Evelyn's closet. This was not accidental. Michael had shown it to her, had opened the double doors with a kind of theatrical flourish, had watched her face as she stepped inside and looked at the ordered rows of clothing, the shelves of shoes, the glass front drawers of accessories. "Try something on," Michael said. Clara turned to look at him. "Are you serious?" "Why not?" He leaned against the doorframe, glass in hand. "She'll never know." There was a half-second pause, something in Clara's expression that might have been hesitation, might have been conscience, might have been the faint animal awareness that this was a line that once crossed could not be uncrossed. Then she reached for a jacket. What happened next was the kind of scene that feels small in the moment and enormous in retrospect. They tried on clothes, they took pictures, Clara put on jewelry from the glass case and turned in front of the mirror, and Michael photographed her and laughed, and they talked about Evelyn the way people talk about someone they have already decided is not quite real as a concept, as an obstacle, as something to be moved around, rather than someone who existed, thought, breathed, and at that exact moment was driving down a private road toward her own front door. After the divorce, Michael said, sitting on the edge of the bed watching Clara examine a necklace in the mirror, "I'm going to fight for this place. I've been here 4 years. I've built a life here." Clara set the necklace down and turned to him. "Can you actually get it in the divorce?" "California is a community property state," Michael said. "Anything acquired during the marriage, but she had it before, some of it. But I've contributed. I've been here. I have standing." He said the words with such confidence, such absolute certainty, that Clara nodded slowly, accepting them as fact. Michael believed what he was saying. That was the most remarkable part. He had told himself this story so many times, had rehearsed the legal arguments so thoroughly in his own head, that he had entirely forgotten to actually verify whether any of it was true. He had never looked at the deed. He had never asked to see it. It had never occurred to him that it would say anything other than what he expected. It was 11:14 p.m. when the first real alarm sounded, not in the house, but in Michael's body. A sudden, sourceless unease, the kind that has no rational explanation, that rises from somewhere below conscious thought, that the body generates when it is registering a threat the mind hasn't identified yet. He stood up from the bed. "You okay?" Clara asked. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I just—" He stopped. He walked to the window. He looked out at the dark grounds below. Nothing moved. Everything was still. "I'm fine." He sat back down, but the feeling did not leave. It sat in the center of his chest like a stone, quiet and heavy, and he could not name it, and he did not try. He poured more wine instead. Evelyn's car passed through the main gate at 11:22 p.m. She had the access code. She had always had the access code because the gate was part of the property that the security system recognized as hers, exclusively hers, regardless of who else had been given temporary access. She had revoked Michael's gate code 4 days ago quietly through the building management system, along with his code for the alarm panel and his access to the secondary security interface. She had not revoked his key to the front door. She wanted him to feel right up until the final moment that this was still a space where he belonged. She parked the car herself, without James's help, in the secondary bay off the east side of the property that Michael did not know existed. She sat for a moment in the dark and silence of the garage. She took 3 slow breaths. She was not nervous. She was precise. She sent one message to Dana Cho. "I'm here." Dana responded immediately. "Everything's filed. Recording is active. We're watching." Evelyn put her phone in her pocket. She walked toward her house. Inside, Michael was telling Clara about Paris. He was describing a trip, a real trip he and Evelyn had taken 2 years ago. A 5-day visit that had been built around a tech summit and had included 2 dinners Evelyn had arranged with European partners and 1 afternoon at the Louvre that Evelyn had insisted on. Michael was telling the story as though it had been his idea, his planning his gift to a wife who didn't appreciate it. "She spent half the trip on the phone," he said. "That's so sad," Clara said in the same tone she always used when they talked about Evelyn, the gentle, automatic sympathy of someone who is accepted without examination, that one person in a story is a villain and the other is not. "It's lonely," Michael said. "It's been lonely for a long time." He almost believed that too. Then the lights came on. Not gradually, not the slow brightening of a dimmer switch being turned up. All at once, every light in the master suite went from off to full without anyone touching anything. Michael was on his feet before he finished processing what had happened. Clara made a sharp sound and grabbed the sheet. "What was that?" she said. "The system," Michael said. His voice was controlled, but his heart was doing something unusual behind his ribs. "It's automated. It must be a glitch." But then the music stopped. The playlist that had been running from the living room speakers, a playlist Clara had put on from her phone connected to the house's audio system, cut off mid-song completely, as though someone had reached into the speakers and pulled the sound out by its root. Silence. Complete, total ringing silence. Michael stood absolutely still, and then he heard from somewhere below them, from the direction of the main staircase, the sound of a door opening. Clara heard it too. She looked at Michael. Her face had changed. The softness was gone, replaced by something sharp and alert. "Michael," she said quietly. "Stay here," he said. He walked out of the master suite and to the top of the staircase and looked down. Evelyn Vance stood at the bottom of the stairs. She was wearing a dark blazer over a simple shirt, her hair pulled back the way she wore it in meetings, not at galas, not at dinners, but in the rooms where actual decisions were made. She had no dramatic entrance, no prop, no performance. She simply stood there at the base of the stairs in her own house and looked up at her husband. And Michael, looking down at her from the top of the stairs, felt something he had not felt in 7 years of knowing this woman. He felt afraid. "Evelyn," he said. He said it the way you say a word when you're buying yourself the fraction of a second needed to choose the next one. "I thought you were in London." "I know you did," she said. Her voice was perfectly level. She might have been discussing a quarterly report. She might have been answering a question about the weather. There was no trembling in it, no accusation, no grief, just information delivered cleanly. "I can explain," he started. "You don't need to," she said. "I already know everything I need to know." The silence that followed was brief and total. Then Clara appeared at Michael's shoulder, having decided incorrectly, as it turned out, that staying in the bedroom alone was the worse option. She had put on one of Evelyn's robes. She appeared to understand immediately and completely from the way Evelyn's eyes moved from Michael to her and back again, without a single visible change of expression, that she had made a catastrophic miscalculation. "Is this—" Clara started. "Yes," Evelyn said simply. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "You are in my home, in my bedroom, wearing my property." She looked at Clara the way you look at a piece of furniture someone has placed incorrectly. "That's going to need to be addressed." Michael came down 2 steps. His instinct was to control the space, to get closer to Evelyn, to use the physicality of his presence, the way he always had, to make himself larger and more authoritative than the situation warranted. "Evelyn, listen to me." "Michael." She said his name the way you say stop. Quiet, absolute. "I'm not here to listen. I'm here to conclude something." He came down 2 more steps. He was performing now. He could not help it. It was the only tool he had, performing the role of reasonable husband wrongly accused, seeking dialogue. "Whatever you think you saw—" "I didn't see anything," Evelyn said. "I documented everything. There's a difference." The word documented hit him somewhere specific. His face did not change, but something behind it did. "What does that mean?" he said. "It means—" Evelyn said that for the past 6 weeks, everything that has happened in this house and in certain hotel rooms in Palo Alto and in several digital communications that you believed were private has been observed, recorded, and preserved in a form that is now in the possession of my attorney and will remain there. Michael had stopped moving. "You're being dramatic," he said, but his voice had changed. Just slightly, just enough. "Am I?" Evelyn said. It was not a question. She walked to the side table in the foyer and picked up a folder, a plain manila folder, unremarkable, the kind you find in any office, and she set it on the bottom step. "That's a summary," she said. "The full documentation is elsewhere, but that will give you a sense of what we have." Michael came down the rest of the stairs. He picked up the folder. He opened it. The first page was a photograph, him and Clara at the Palo Alto Hotel entering together, time-stamped. The second page was a credit card statement, the secondary card, the business account he had opened specifically to hide these expenses. Every charge, every date, every hotel. He turned to the third page. His hands stopped moving. The third page was not about Clara. The third page was a communication log, anonymized addresses, relay, servers, dates, and at the bottom of it, a name he had never spoken aloud to Evelyn, had never had any reason to speak aloud to Evelyn, had never once imagined she would find: Derek Calloway. "Evelyn," he started. "Don't," she said. He looked up from the folder. She was watching him with those still measuring eyes, and for the first time, Michael Thorne had the vertiginous sensation of understanding what it actually felt like to be on the other side of Evelyn Vance's full attention. He had lived beside this woman for 7 years. He had mistaken her stillness for passivity, her precision for coldness, her focus for limitation. He had been so profoundly wrong. "How much do you know?" he said. His voice was different now. The performance was gone. What was underneath it was smaller and harder and much more frightened. "Enough," she said. "The specifics are for the relevant federal authorities." The word federal landed in the room like a physical object. Clara made a sound from the top of the stairs. Michael did not look at her. "You went to the FBI," he said. "I provided information to the appropriate parties," Evelyn said. "What they do with it is no longer in my hands." He set the folder down on the step very carefully, the way you set something down when you are trying to appear calm and your hands are not cooperating. "This is Evelyn. This is not what it looks like. The Calloway contact it was exploratory. It wasn't anything actionable. I never actually transferred—" "Michael." Her voice cut through his words cleanly, without force, without heat. "Stop talking. Every word you say right now is being recorded." His mouth closed. He stood on the stairs of a house he did not own in a marriage he had hollowed out from the inside, holding a folder of evidence he had been certain would never exist, and he understood for the first time with the specific clarity that only comes when there is no alternative that he had lost. Not tonight, not in this moment. He had lost the moment Evelyn had found that hotel receipt and chosen with perfect control to say nothing. He had lost the moment she had picked up the phone and called Patricia Solis. He had lost in 23 days of careful, methodical, invisible work that he had been completely unable to see because he had never believed she was capable of it. That was the thing that was going to stay with him longest. Not the evidence, not the arrest when it came, not the lawyers or the headlines or the slow public unwinding of everything he had constructed. The thing that was going to stay with him was the realization that for every day of the last 6 weeks, while he had been feeling free, while he had been feeling untouchable and clever, and finally himself, Evelyn had been watching. She had been watching and waiting and building, and she had never once let it show. "There are 2 gentlemen outside," Evelyn said. Her voice was entirely unchanged. "James will show you where to collect your personal items, the things that are verifiably yours, not property of this household. You have 30 minutes. "Evelyn and Clara," Evelyn said, looking up the stairs where Clara stood with her arms wrapped around herself in Evelyn's robe. "I'd like my things back before you leave." The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. Michael looked at his wife, the woman he had underestimated in every possible way for every year he had known her, and he opened his mouth once more. Maybe to argue, maybe to beg, maybe simply because he could not yet accept that there were no more moves available to him. But Evelyn had already turned away. She walked toward the kitchen, unhurried, her heels quiet on the stone floor, and she did not look back, because she had already seen everything she needed to see. The doors to the main hall opened from the outside, and James Carver stepped in, followed by a second man Michael did not recognize, and both of them looked at Michael with the specific professional blankness of people who have been hired to handle a situation, not to judge it. "Mr. Thorne," James said, "whenever you're ready." Michael stood on the stairs of a house that had never belonged to him, and for the first time in his adult life, he had absolutely nothing left to say. James Carver did not raise his voice. He never did. That was the thing about men like James. They had spent enough years in rooms where the wrong word at the wrong volume could end someone's life, and the habit of controlled quiet had become permanent. He simply stood at the base of the stairs, hands loose at his sides, and waited for Michael to make a decision. Michael made several decisions in the span of about 4 seconds, and then unmade all of them. He thought about arguing. He thought about demanding to see documentation. He thought about calling his own attorney, whose number was in his phone, whose voicemail he would almost certainly reach at 11:47 on a Friday night. He thought about walking past James and the other man, whose name he didn't know, and whose stillness was somehow more unsettling than James's, and going to find Evelyn in the kitchen and forcing a conversation she had clearly already decided was finished. He did none of these things, because the folder was still in his hands, and the third page was still in his mind, and the name Derek Calloway was sitting at the center of his chest like a coal. He had spent 9 months being very careful. He had used the prepaid device. He had met in person whenever possible. He had routed communications through enough layers that he had genuinely believed had staked everything on the belief that there was no traceable line between himself and what he had been doing for Cybernetics Group. But the third page of that folder existed, which meant the line had been traced, which meant that somewhere in the past 9 months in a gap he had not identified and could not now reconstruct, someone had found the thread and pulled it. "Mr. Thorne," James said again, patient, immovable. Michael set the folder down on the step. He set it down carefully, the way you handle something when you're trying to demonstrate that you are composed, that you are reasonable, that you are a man who makes thoughtful choices even when every internal signal is screaming in the opposite direction. 30 minutes, Michael said. "Yes, sir," James said. Michael went upstairs. Clara was sitting on the edge of the bed when he walked back into the master suite. She had taken off Evelyn's robe. She was in her own clothes again, and the transformation was more complete than just the clothing. She looked younger, somehow smaller, as though the confidence she had carried into this house 3 hours ago had been quietly removed from her along with the borrowed silk. "What's happening?" she said. Michael went directly to the closet. His side of the closet, the smaller section, the part that in retrospect he could see had always been clearly demarcated, always just slightly separate from Evelyn's organized half, as though the space itself had known something he hadn't. He started pulling shirts off hangers. "We're leaving," he said. "I can see that." Clara stood up. "Michael, what was in that folder? What did she say to you?" "Not now. Not now." Her voice went up slightly. "She just walked into, we were just in her, Michael. I need to know what's happening." He stopped. He turned to look at her. And in that moment, with the specific unsentimentality of a man whose options have just been drastically reduced, he looked at Clara Simmons, 26-year-old marketing consultant, the woman he had told his secrets to in hotel rooms in Palo Alto, and he saw her clearly, maybe for the first time. She was not equipped for this. She had signed up for the version of Michael Thorne that he performed in those hotel rooms, the wronged husband, the powerful man temporarily misplaced in someone else's life, the person who was going to be free soon, very soon, and then everything would be different. That version of Michael had nothing to do with federal documentation and prepaid tablets and a name like Derek Calloway. "Go wait by the front door," he said. "Michael." "Clara," his voice was flat. "Please go wait by the front door." She looked at him for another moment, searching his face for something reassurance maybe, or the version of him she thought she knew, and found nothing she recognized. Then she picked up her bag and walked out of the room without saying anything else. Michael turned back to the closet. He worked fast and without sentimentality. Closed toiletries, the watch his father had left him, the one actual valuable thing he had brought into this marriage that was genuinely his laptop, his phone charger. The small external hard drive that he kept in the back of his nightstand drawer and that he reached for automatically by reflex before his brain caught up with his hand and he stopped. He held the hard drive. He stood completely still for approximately 5 seconds. Then he put it in his jacket pocket and continued packing. It was 12:03 a.m. Downstairs, Evelyn was in the kitchen. She was making tea, not because she particularly wanted tea, but because her hands needed something to do, and she had learned a long time ago that in moments of high internal pressure, giving her hands a task kept her mind from running too fast in too many directions at once. She heard the movement upstairs, footsteps, the sound of drawers, the ordinary sounds of someone leaving a place they had occupied for years compressed into 30 minutes. She wrapped both hands around the mug and stood at the kitchen island and breathed. Her phone lit up on the counter. Patricia Solis. She answered immediately. "He's collecting personal items," Evelyn said quietly. "James is monitoring." "I know," Patricia said. "James is sending me timestamps. I'm watching the secondary feeds." A pause. "How are you doing?" "I'm fine." "Evelyn." "I'm functional," Evelyn said, which was more accurate and which Patricia understood to be as much honesty as was available right now. "Okay," Patricia said. "One thing I need you to know. We got word 20 minutes ago from Agent Haynes. The warrant application is moving faster than expected. Could be as early as Monday." Evelyn set her mug down. "Monday. Possibly sooner. The documentation you provided was apparently it was significant. More than they expected." "More than they expected," Evelyn repeated. The Callaway angle is bigger than your initial report suggested. Haynes says there are other parties involved. Cybernetics wasn't the only company receiving material. The kitchen was very quiet. How many? Evelyn asked. They're still mapping it, Patricia said. But Evelyn, what Michael gave them wasn't just architecture files. There were personnel records in the transfer, internal communication about future product development, roadmap documents. Evelyn closed her eyes for 3 seconds. She opened them. He gave them the roadmap. Preliminary versions, but yes, she had spent 14 months on that roadmap, 14 months of internal workshops and research sessions, and the careful, painstaking work of building a coherent vision for where Ether AI was going over the next 5 years. It was the most sensitive internal document the company possessed, more sensitive in some ways than the technical architecture, because the architecture could be replicated expensively slowly, but the roadmap was strategic. It told you not just what Ether AI could do, but what it was planning to do next and when and how. Michael had sat in their kitchen reading the newspaper while she worked on that document. He had asked her once what she was working on, and she had said carefully something general about planning cycles, and he had nodded and refilled his coffee and gone back to whatever he was reading. And then at some point, she had not yet been able to precisely identify he had accessed it. "Patricia," she said. "Yes. Tell Agent Haynes that I'll make myself available whenever he needs. Whatever they need from me, whenever they need it. I have no interest in obstructing the timeline on this." "I'll tell him. And Patricia," she paused, "thank you for everything, for all 23 days of it." "You did the hard part," Patricia said. "You stayed calm." Evelyn picked up her mug again. It was the only option. She hung up and stood in the kitchen. That was hers. The house that was hers. The company that was hers. The life that was hers. And she let herself feel for just 30 seconds the full weight of what had been done to her. Not the betrayal of the marriage, though, that was real and would need to be processed in its own time, in its own private space. The specific particular violation of watching someone use your trust as a door into your life's work. Of understanding that while she had been building, Michael had been dismantling. That every meeting he attended, every event he appeared at by her side, every quiet evening in this house had been simultaneously an access point. 30 seconds. Then she set the feeling down, the way you set a heavy bag down when you've reached your destination and you no longer need to carry it. She heard footsteps on the stairs. Michael came into the kitchen doorway with a bag over his shoulder. He stopped when he saw her standing at the island. He had composed himself. She could see the effort of it in the set of his jaw, the deliberate steadiness of his posture, and for a moment he looked almost like the man she had thought she married. Almost. "I want to talk to you," he said. "There's nothing to talk about," she said. "Evelyn, 7 years. You don't just... Michael." She turned to face him fully. "I'm going to say this once clearly, because I think clarity is the only thing either of us needs right now. I know about Clara. I know about the hotel. I know about the credit card. And I know about Derek Callaway and Cybernetics Group and the documents you transferred over the course of 9 months using a prepaid device you purchased in Fresno." His face went through several things very quickly. "I know," she continued, "because I looked. Because when I find a hotel receipt in a jacket pocket, I don't make assumptions, I investigate. That's what I do. It's what I've always done. You knew that about me when you married me." She paused. "Or you should have." "Evelyn, the Callaway thing I need you to understand. The Callaway thing," she said, and there was something in her voice now. Not heat, not anger, but a kind of absolute bedrock sorrow that was worse than either is not something I can help you with. That's not a marriage problem. That's a federal problem. And it stopped being in my hands the moment I turned the documentation over to Agent Haynes. Michael's bag slipped slightly off his shoulder. He caught it. You already gave it to..." "Yes," she said. "When..." 11 days ago." The silence lasted a long time. 11 days, he said. Not a question, just the number repeated as he began to understand the shape of the past 11 days. The dinners, the conversations, the normal Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday of a marriage that had already legally and formally been handed to federal investigators. "You sat across from me at dinner," he said slowly. "For 11 days, you knew, And you sat across from me, the same way you sat across from me for 9 months, Evelyn said quietly, while you were doing what you were doing. That stopped him completely. He stood in the doorway of her kitchen and he had no answer for that, because there was no answer for that. It was the most precise and devastating thing she could have said, and they both knew it, and the knowing of it sat between them in the air like something physical. Clara's voice came from the direction of the foyer, tight and careful. "Michael, James says we need to go." Michael did not move immediately. He stood in the doorway and looked at his wife. Looked at her, the way you look at something when you are trying to memorize it and erase it simultaneously. And then he said very quietly, "I'm sorry." Evelyn looked at him. "I know you are," she said. "That's not the same as it being enough." He left. She heard the front door. She heard the sound of James's voice, low and professional, and the other man's footsteps, and then the sound of vehicles on the private road engines diminishing into the night. Then the house was quiet. Evelyn stood in her kitchen at 12:19 a.m. and listened to the silence. She had imagined this moment many times over the past 23 days, had rehearsed what she might feel: relief, maybe, vindication, something clean and hard and final. She had not expected this specific texture of quiet, which was not peaceful exactly, but was at least honest. The house felt like itself again, not inhabited by a lie. She finished her tea. Then she went to work, because Evelyn Vance did not stop at closed chapters. She had built an entire company on the principle that the moment after a crisis resolved was the most important moment. The moment when other people rested, regrouped, processed, and she moved. She went to her office, the private office off the east hallway that Michael had never had a reason to enter, that was coded to her fingerprint, and her alone. And she opened her laptop, and she began reviewing the full scope of what Patricia's team and Agent Haynes's office had identified. The roadmap documents, the personnel files, the architectural data. She needed to understand precisely and completely what had left this building and where it had gone, and what it would take to contain the damage. She worked until 3 a.m., then until 4. At 4:17 a.m., she sent an encrypted message to her chief technology officer, a brilliant and exhaustingly energetic woman named Sandra Park, who kept programmer's hours by preference and was reliably awake at this time of night. The message said, "I need you. Not at the office here. Can you come now?" Sandra's reply arrived in 40 seconds. "On my way." "Everything okay?" Evelyn typed, "No, but it will be." Sandra arrived at 5:30 a.m. with 2 cups of coffee she had stopped to buy on the drive over, because Sandra Park had known Evelyn Vance for 6 years and understood that in a crisis, Evelyn needed information and caffeine and someone technically brilliant to think out loud with in that order. She set the coffee on the desk and looked at Evelyn at the laptop, the printed documents, the legal pad covered in Evelyn's precise handwriting, and she sat down across from her without being asked. "Tell me everything," Sandra said. So Evelyn did. She told it the way she told everything, linearly, precisely, without unnecessary emotion, covering the facts in the order they had occurred and their implications in the order they mattered. She told Sandra about Michael, about Clara, about Calloway, about the 9 months of transfers. She laid the technical documents on the desk between them and walked Sandra through what had been taken and when. Sandra was quiet through all of it. She did not interrupt. She asked 3 clarifying questions, each of which was exactly the right question. And when Evelyn finished, Sandra sat for a moment with her coffee cup held in both hands, and she said, "The roadmap is the worst part." "Yes," Evelyn said. "If cybernetics has the roadmap, they know what we're building next. They know the timeline. They know the resource allocation." Evelyn's voice was steady. "They can position themselves to be in market before we announce, or they can use the architecture to build something that appears to arrive independently." "Patent priority," Sandra said. "That's the risk." Sandra set her coffee down. "Okay." She pulled the laptop toward her. "Can I?" "Please," Evelyn said. Sandra began to work. Her fingers on the keyboard had a different rhythm than Evelyn's, faster, less deliberate. The speed of someone who thought in code, and watching her work was, Evelyn found, genuinely calming. There was something clarifying about sitting across from someone who was immediately practically engaged with a problem. At 6:04 a.m., Sandra said without looking up, The architecture transfers, some of these are pre-release versions, proof of concept stage. If cybernetics built on these, they'd be building on incomplete foundations. What does that mean practically? Evelyn asked. It means whatever they built is probably broken, or at least brittle. Sandra looked up. The versions he accessed were from 18 months ago. We've done 3 major revision cycles since then. What he gave them is it's like giving someone half a blueprint for a bridge and letting them build it. So the structure they build will have flaws. Big ones. And the flaws will be specific and identifiable. Sandra's expression shifted, the particular look of a person who has just seen the shape of a solution through a problem. Evelyn, if they tried to patent anything based on what they received, the flaws will be in the patent. We can trace the intellectual lineage directly. Evelyn was very still. We can prove in court, she said slowly, that whatever they file originated with us. Incomplete copies of our work, yes. Sandra. Evelyn looked at her across the desk. That's not just a defense. Sandra nodded, and her expression had moved fully into something that in anyone else might have been called a grin, but in Sandra Park looked more like a very precisely calibrated expression of professional satisfaction. That's a lawsuit. For the first time since she had driven out of that hotel parking structure at 11 p.m. the previous night, Evelyn felt something release in her chest. Not relief, too small a word, something structural. The sense of a foundation settling back into place. The damage was real, but it was not unrecoverable. Nothing, it turned out, was unrecoverable. Her phone lit up at 6:31 a.m. Agent Robert Haynes. She answered. Mrs. Thorne. He said the last time anyone would use that name in relation to her, she decided in that moment, absolutely, and finally, I apologize for the early hour. I haven't slept, she said. Go ahead. We executed a preliminary contact with Cybernetics Group Counsel this morning. As a result of that contact and several parallel developments in the past 18 hours, we're accelerating the warrant timeline. He paused. I want to be transparent with you. This investigation has grown significantly beyond the initial scope of your report. Patricia told me there were other parties. Several, Haynes said. Without going into specifics, I'm not yet at liberty to discuss the documents your husband transferred. We're not the only materials moving through the channels we've identified. Cybernetics appears to have been running a systematic acquisition operation targeting multiple AI companies over an 18-month period. Your husband was one of several access points. Evelyn absorbed this. He wasn't the architect of it, she said. Not a defense, just a question seeking accuracy. He was a recruited asset, Haynes said carefully. A willing one, but recruited. She thought about Derek Calloway at the charity golf tournament in Pebble Beach. She thought about the way a man like Michael Charming, underemployed in the specific way of someone living off another person's success, hungry for something he could call his own, would respond to being identified, approached and told that he was valuable, that he had something to offer, that there were people who saw his potential. She thought about how that must have felt. And then she put the thought away, because the feeling that came with it was too close to understanding, and she was not ready tonight to understand Michael Thorne. That would come later, probably in a therapist's office or a quiet evening, or the kind of 3 a.m. moment that found her anyway. Tonight she needed clarity, not empathy. What do you need from me? She said. Availability, Haynes said. For the next 72 hours, as this moves forward, we may need responses quickly. And I want to be honest with you. When this becomes public, and it will become public likely within the week, the company's communications team needs to be ready. They'll be ready, Evelyn said. She hung up and looked at Sandra across the desk. It's going to be public, she said. Sandra nodded. Then we get ahead of it. Yes, Evelyn said. We do. She picked up her phone again and scrolled to a contact she had prepared for this possibility, but had hoped in some vestigial part of herself she would not need. Her head of corporate communications, a man named Thomas Reyes, who had managed crises for 3 different Fortune 500 companies, and who had once told Evelyn in an interview for the position that the only difference between a disaster and a narrative was who spoke first. She called him. He answered on the second ring, which told her he had been expecting the call. Thomas, she said, we're going public. I'll tell you everything. I need a statement framework by noon, and I need to know what we're saying, how we're saying it, and who we're protecting. I'm listening, Thomas said. Outside, the sun was coming up over Atherton. The house caught the light, the way it always did. The stone warmed the windows, shifted from black to deep amber. And inside, Evelyn Vance sat at her desk with her CTO and her phone and her legal pad. And she began with the focused urgency that had built Ether AI from a concept into a billion-dollar company to build something new. Not from nothing. From the rubble of what Michael had tried to take from her. She had been underestimated. She had been betrayed. She had been operated on from the inside by someone she had trusted in the particular and irreversible way that only comes with 7 years of shared life. And she was still here, still working, still building. At 7:15 a.m., Michael Thorne checked into a hotel in Palo Alto under his own name, using his own credit card, because the business card account had already been flagged and frozen by Dana Cho's office at midnight. He sat on the edge of the hotel bed with his bag beside him and his phone in his hand, and he looked at the screen, and he thought about calling his lawyer. Then he thought about what his lawyer was going to say when he explained the Derek Calloway situation. He put the phone face down on the bed. Clara had not come to the hotel. She had gotten into her own car in the driveway of the Atherton mansion, and she had driven away without saying goodbye, and Michael had watched her taillights disappear and felt nothing except a distant, abstract awareness that she had been the first domino to fall, and the others were still falling, and there was nothing left to do but wait for the sound they made when they hit the ground. He lay back on the hotel bed without taking off his shoes. The ceiling above him was exactly the same as every hotel ceiling he had ever stared at, white, featureless, offering nothing. He thought about Evelyn standing in her kitchen holding her mug with both hands completely unmoved. He thought about the way she had said the same way you sat across from me for 9 months, and the way that sentence had closed every argument he had been forming before he could open his mouth. He thought about Derek Calloway. He thought about the prepaid tablet and the relay servers and all the careful, invisible architecture he had built around his other life, and how thoroughly, how completely, how invisibly it had been seen through. He thought, she was always smarter than me. And then, because even now some part of him resisted the full weight of that thought, but she didn't have to do it this way. He held on to that for a while. It was smaller comfort than he needed and more than he deserved, and he knew both things, and he held it anyway. At 7:43 a.m., his phone rang. The number on the screen was one he recognized. His attorney, Raymond Chu, who apparently did check his messages on Friday nights. Michael stared at the name on the screen. Then he answered. "Raymond," he said. "Michael." Raymond's voice was tight in a way it had never been before. "I just received a call from a federal agent named Haynes. He's asking for your availability for an interview. Michael, I need you to tell me right now, what did you do?" Michael closed his eyes. Outside the hotel window, the morning was fully arrived, indifferent and bright, carrying no particular feeling about what it found when it got there. "It's complicated," Michael said. "It always is," Raymond said. "Start talking." Raymond Chu had been a criminal defense attorney for 19 years. He had represented hedge fund managers and pharmaceutical executives, and one very prominent city councilman whose particular set of crimes had kept Raymond employed for the better part of 3 years. He was not easily shaken. He had the specific cultivated composure of a man who had spent nearly 2 decades sitting across from people in the worst moments of their lives and maintaining eye contact without flinching. But when Michael finished talking all of it from Pebble Beach to the prepaid tablet to Derek Calloway to the roadmap documents, Raymond was quiet for a long time. A long time. "Raymond," Michael said. "I'm here," Raymond said. I'm processing the scope of what you've described. I know it sounds—" "Michael." Raymond's voice had changed. The professional warmth was gone, replaced by something more precise and less comfortable. "I need you to understand what you're telling me. This is not a divorce complication. This is not a civil matter. What you're describing is economic espionage under federal statute. Depending on what was transferred and how it was classified, we could be looking at charges that carry 10 to 15 years. The hotel room was very quiet. "I was a conduit," Michael said. I wasn't making the decisions about what to take or where to send it. Calloway directed everything. You were willing," Raymond said. "That's what the statute requires. You were willing, and you were compensated." Michael opened his mouth, closed it. "Were you compensated?" Raymond asked. a pause that lasted slightly too long. There was an arrangement. How much? Across the 9 months, approximately 400,000. Raymond breathed out through his nose. Michael could hear it clearly over the phone. Where did it go? A separate account, offshore, Cayman structured. Does Evelyn know about the account? I don't know what Evelyn knows, Michael said, and the honesty of that sentence, the raw, newly acquired humility of a man who has just discovered that he has dramatically underestimated someone for 7 years, came through in his voice in a way that Raymond registered but did not address. Okay, Raymond said. Here is what's going to happen right now. You are not going to contact Derek Calloway. You are not going to contact anyone at Cybernetics Group. You are not going to access the offshore account. You are not going to transfer anything out of it. You are not going to do anything that creates the appearance of obstruction. Do you understand me? Yes. And the hard drive. Silence. Michael, the hard drive in your jacket pocket. I'm not asking if it exists. I'm telling you that I know it exists because you told me 9 months ago that you were keeping local copies as insurance and because you are the kind of man who would reach for insurance on his way out the door. Another silence, longer this time. What about it? Michael said finally. Don't touch it, Raymond said. Don't access it. Don't copy it. Don't dispose of it. In fact, I want you to put it in the hotel safe right now and not think about it until I tell you to. If the FBI executes a warrant and that drive shows signs of tampering, we lose every possible negotiating position we have. Michael walked to the hotel safe. He put the hard drive inside. He closed the door and entered a code. Done, he said. Good. Raymond's voice had taken on the specific, organized urgency of a man who has shifted from shock into strategy. I'm going to call Agent Haynes back this morning and arrange a preliminary conversation, not an interview, a conversation. Our framing is going to be cooperation, not admission, not confession, cooperation. You came forward with information. You want to assist the investigation. I didn't come forward, Michael said. They came to me. They came to you because your wife handed them a complete evidentiary package, Raymond said, and the flatness of that statement, the sheer unvarnished fact of it, landed in the hotel room like something dropped from a height. But what matters now is not the sequence. What matters is the posture we present going forward, and our posture is cooperative. What does cooperation get me? Potentially, Raymond said carefully, it gets you from 10 to 15 years down to something manageable. Potentially. I'm not making promises. I'm telling you it's the only path that isn't a cliff. Michael sat back down on the edge of the bed. Call Haynes, he said. It was 8:11 a.m. on a Saturday morning. While Raymond Chu was drafting his talking points for a call with the FBI, and Michael Thorne was sitting in a Palo Alto hotel room with the specific hollow stillness of a man who has run out of moves, Evelyn Vance was on her second cup of coffee and her fourth strategic conversation of the morning, and she was by any objective measure winning. Thomas Reyes had arrived at the house at 8:30 a.m. with his laptop and a yellow legal pad, and the quietly efficient energy of a man who considered a crisis a professional opportunity. He and Evelyn sat at the kitchen table, the same kitchen table where Michael had poured wine and felt free just 9 hours earlier, and they built the public narrative together, sentence by careful sentence. The central message, Thomas said, needs to be about the company, not about the marriage, not about the betrayal. The moment this becomes a story about a wife and her cheating husband, we've lost control of the frame. Agreed, Evelyn said. So the story is Ether AI discovered and reported an external attempt to misappropriate proprietary technology. The company cooperated fully with federal investigators. The integrity of the platform is intact. He looked up from his legal pad. We lead with strength. We lead with action taken. We do not lead with victimhood. I'm not a victim, Evelyn said. Thomas looked at her for a moment. No, he said. That's the point. Sandra, who had been working at the desk across the room for the past 3 hours, spoke without looking up. The patent filing is more important than the public statement right now. If Cybernetics has filed anything based on what they received, we need to challenge it before the news cycle gives them cover to claim independent development. How quickly can we file? Evelyn asked. I already have our IP counsel on a call, Sandra said. We're looking at emergency filing as early as Monday. But I need the full technical inventory of what was transferred to scope the challenge correctly. She finally looked up. "Evelyn, I need the complete list." "I'll have Patricia send it to you directly." "Today." "Within the hour," Evelyn said. It was 9:04 a.m. The call from Agent Haynes came at 9:47 a.m. He was brief and professional and told her two things that changed the shape of the day. The first was that Raymond Chu had already been in contact, and that Michael's posture of cooperation, while noted, did not alter the evidentiary picture that Evelyn's documentation had already established. In Haynes's careful, measured language, what this meant was that Michael's cooperation might affect his sentencing exposure, but had no practical effect on the investigation itself, which was already largely complete. The second thing Haynes told her was that Derek Calloway had been taken in for questioning at 7 a.m. that morning. Evelyn set her coffee cup down. "Calloway cooperated," Haynes said, quickly, in a way that suggests he was already aware the situation was compromised. A pause. "Mrs. Thorne, Ms. Vance, what he provided goes substantially beyond your husband's role." "You said there were other companies involved," Evelyn said. "4 others," Haynes said. "All AI or machine learning companies operating in the Bay Area, all with an internal contact recruited through social engineering over the past 24 months. Cybernetics was running what amounts to a systematic intelligence operation against domestic technology companies." Evelyn stood up from the kitchen table and walked to the window. She was aware of Thomas and Sandra going quiet behind her watching. "This is bigger than Michael," she said. "Significantly," Haynes said. "Your husband was one piece. He was the piece that gave us the thread to pull. But what we found on the other end of that thread is a much larger structure." "The other companies," Evelyn said. "Do they know?" "We're notifying them this morning," Haynes said. "Standard procedure is to notify before public disclosure. You were the first call because your documentation initiated the investigation." She thought about 4 other CEOs receiving calls like this one on a Saturday morning, sitting down with the information that someone inside their organization had been working against them. She thought about what that felt like from the inside, not in an abstract way, but in the specific physical way of a person who had been living that feeling for 6 weeks. "Is there anything I can do for them?" she said. Haynes paused. "I'm sorry. The other companies, the other CEOs. Is there anything I can do, share, provide, offer that would help them manage what's coming?" A longer pause. "That's not a question I typically receive in this part of a conversation," Haynes said. "I imagine not," Evelyn said. "But I'm asking it." "I'll have to think about what's appropriate," he said. "Give me until this afternoon." She hung up and turned back to the room. Thomas and Sandra were both watching her. "4 other companies," she said. Sandra's jaw tightened. "Calloway's network. We're the biggest piece, but not the only one." Evelyn came back to the table. "Thomas, I want to adjust the public statement. Not the framing, keep the strength, keep the company first narrative, but I want to add language about industry solidarity, about the responsibility of technology companies to protect not just their own assets, but the integrity of the field." Thomas was already writing. "That positions you as a leader in the response, not just a victim of the inciting event." "Exactly," Sandra said quietly. "This is going to make you the face of something much larger than a corporate espionage case." "I know," Evelyn said. She sat down. She thought about it for a moment, the weight of it, the visibility of it, the way the next several weeks were going to feel nothing like the controlled private operation she had been running for the past 23 days. It was going to be public and loud and relentless, and she was going to be at the center of it. She thought about whether she was ready for that. Then she thought about 14 months of roadmap work and the people on her team who had spent nights and weekends building something they believed in, and the 4 other companies waking up to Saturday morning phone calls from federal agents, and she decided that ready was a choice you made, not a feeling you waited for. "Let's finish the statement," she said. It was 10:23 a.m. when Clara Simmons pulled into the parking lot of her apartment complex in Sunnyvale, turned off her car, and sat in the silence for a long time. She had driven from Atherton in a state that was not quite shock, and not quite grief, and not quite anger, but some specific combination of all 3 that she couldn't name that sat in her chest and made it difficult to breathe properly. She had known going into this that Michael was married. She had known it and had performed for her own benefit the specific emotional calculus that people perform when they want to do something they understand is wrong, the reduction of the wife to an abstraction, the elevation of the affair to a narrative about authenticity, and feeling trapped and finding something real. She had told herself the story that Michael told, because it was easier to live inside his story than to examine her own role in it clearly. Standing in Evelyn Vance's bedroom, wearing Evelyn Vance's robe, looking at a woman who had just walked into her own house and spoken with the quiet authority of someone who owned every cubic foot of air in it, that story had stopped working. Clara was 26 years old, and she was not stupid and she was not cruel, and the fact that she had arrived at a place where she could have been described as both of those things by someone looking at the situation from the outside was something she was going to have to spend a significant amount of time understanding. But that was for later. Right now, she sat in her car and thought about the way Evelyn had looked at her. Not with rage, not with the dramatic confrontational energy that Clara had always imagined in her occasional guilty imaginings of this scenario. Just with those still measuring eyes that recorded and registered and passed on, that found Clara neither interesting enough to hate nor important enough to address at length. That was worse than rage would have been. She got out of her car and went inside. She did not call Michael. She had his number blocked before she reached her apartment door. Not dramatically, not with any particular ceremony. She just opened her phone and blocked it the way you remove something from a space when you realize it's been taking up room you need. She was done. Whatever came next for Michael Thorne, it was going to happen without her as a witness, and that was the last decision she made about him. At 11:58 a.m., Dana Cho filed the divorce petition in Santa Clara County Superior Court. The filing was clean, complete, and comprehensive. It cited irreconcilable differences. The standard language, but attached as exhibits, were the evidence documentation from Meridian Consulting, the credit card records, the hotel timestamps, and the morality clause from the prenuptial agreement, with a detailed legal analysis of how and when it had been triggered. The morality clause was the instrument that made everything else irrelevant. Michael had signed a prenuptial agreement that contained on page 31 of a 44-page document a clause that voided his entitlement to any marital assets in the event of documented infidelity. The clause had been drafted by Dana Cho with the specific surgical precision of someone who had been practicing family law for 25 years and had seen every version of this story before. It was not ambiguous. It did not have exceptions. It did not require negotiation. The moment Evelyn filed Michael's legal claim to any shared marital asset, any asset that might otherwise have been subject to California's community property framework, was void. He had known the clause existed. He had not read it carefully enough to understand what triggered it. That was in retrospect the single most expensive decision of his life, more expensive than the affair, more expensive than the Callaway arrangement, more expensive than all of it combined. Raymond Chu received the filing notification at 12:14 p.m. He called Michael immediately. "The divorce has been filed," he said. Michael was still in the hotel room. He had not left it. He had ordered room service at some point and eaten approximately half of it and left the rest on the cart by the door. I assumed it would be. Dana Cho filed with the morality clause activated and fully documented, Raymond said. A pause. What does that mean for the asset picture? It means, Raymond said carefully, that under the terms of the agreement you signed, you are entitled to the personal property you had prior to the marriage, your personal banking accounts as they stood on the date of your marriage, and any assets you can demonstrate were acquired exclusively through your own income during the marriage. He paused. That last category, given that your primary source of income during the marriage was a position at a company Evelyn provided access to, is going to be extremely limited. The offshore account, Michael said, is potentially traceable to criminal activity, Raymond said, which means it is potentially subject to asset forfeiture in addition to being excluded from the divorce settlement. Another pause. Michael, I need you to understand where you are right now in terms of financial position. Tell me. You have what's in your personal checking account. You have the watch your father left you. You have the clothes in that bag. Raymond's voice was not unkind, but it was completely unflinchingly honest. That is approximately the full picture of your current net worth. Michael sat on the hotel bed. He thought about the mansion in Atherton, which had never had his name on it. He thought about the wine cellar and the chef's kitchen and the guest suite and the 2 acres of carefully maintained grounds. He thought about the life he had moved through for 4 years, touching things and using things and believing with such absolute unexamined confidence that they were his. None of it had ever been his. Not a gram, not a dollar, not a square foot. He had been for 4 years living inside someone else's asset, and he had never once thought to check. "Raymond," he said. "Yes." "The interview with Haynes. Monday morning," Raymond said. 10 a.m. We're going in cooperative. We're going in with everything you know about Callaway's operation, the contacts, the structure, the other recruitment targets if you know them. The more useful you are to the federal case, the better your position. And if I'm not useful enough, Raymond was quiet for a moment. Then we focus on mitigation. First offense, no prior criminal record, cooperation offered voluntarily. He let the pause do its work. But Michael, I want to be honest with you. The documentation Evelyn provided was thorough. I've been in this business for 19 years, and I have rarely seen a private evidentiary package as complete as what Agent Haynes described to me this morning. Whatever we present on Monday, we are not walking into that room with leverage. We are walking in with information and a willingness to cooperate, and we are hoping that is enough. She was thorough, Michael said quietly. She's always been thorough. Yes, Raymond said. She was. At 2:30 p.m., Evelyn received a call from a woman named Janet Okafor, the CEO of a machine learning startup called Apex Neural, one of the 4 other companies Agent Haynes had mentioned. Janet had gotten Evelyn's personal number from Haynes with Evelyn's prior consent, and she called with the specific, barely controlled composure of someone who had been processing very bad news for approximately 5 hours. "I want to thank you," Janet said without preamble. "You don't need to," Evelyn said. "I do. Because of what you found and what you reported, we were notified before the story breaks. We have time to protect our people, talk to our investors, control the message." Her voice tightened. "Our internal contact had access to our Series B projections. If cybernetics had moved on that information before we knew—" "I understand," Evelyn said quietly, because she did. She understood exactly. "How did you know to look?" Janet asked. "What made you—" "A hotel receipt," Evelyn said. A brief silence. "That's it." "That's all it took," Evelyn said. "One thing that didn't fit. And then I looked at everything else." Janet was quiet for a moment. "You know what gets me," she said. "We trust these people. We bring them into our work, into our companies, into our homes. And they—" "I know," Evelyn said. "How are you doing, honestly?" Evelyn considered the question. "I'm working," she said. "Right now, working is the honest answer." "Me too," Janet said. "But Evelyn, when this is over, when the legal part is finished and the dust settles, I'd like to have a real conversation with you about what comes next, about what we build from here." Evelyn felt something shift in her chest. Not the relief she had been waiting for, but something adjacent to it. Something that had a future tense attached to it. "I'd like that," she said. At 4:45 p.m., Evelyn's head of investor relations sent an urgent message. Word had begun to move through the investment community, not public yet, not official, but the particular seismic rumbling that moves through networks of money when something significant is about to become visible. 3 of Ether AI's major institutional investors had requested calls. 2 board members had reached out directly to Evelyn's personal line. She handled each one with the same composure she had been operating from since midnight. Clear, factual company, first strength forward. She had anticipated this. She had prepared talking points for each category of stakeholder. She moved through the calls with the systematic efficiency of someone who had been running at full capacity for the past 18 hours and had not yet found the edge of what she could sustain. At 6 p.m., Sandra sent a message from the desk across the room. She had been there for 12 hours. The message said, "Eat something. I'm ordering food. Don't argue." Evelyn looked at the message. She looked at Sandra's back, still bent over the laptop. She typed back, "Thank you." Sandra replied, "Don't thank me. Eat." At 7:19 p.m., the first media inquiry arrived. a technology journalist at a major publication whose sources inside the federal system had apparently been faster than Haynes had expected. The inquiry was sent to Ether AI's press email and forwarded immediately to Thomas Reyes, who sent Evelyn a single word, "ready." She replied, "Send it." The statement went out at 7:45 p.m. It was by every measure Thomas had intended a statement of strength. It acknowledged the investigation. It confirmed Ether AI's cooperation with federal authorities. It described the company's discovery and reporting of an external attempt to misappropriate proprietary technology. And in its final paragraph, it did something that Thomas had initially been uncertain about and had ultimately agreed was the right call. It spoke directly to the other companies, to the broader industry, to every technology founder and CEO operating in a space where trust was a necessary vulnerability and betrayal was a real and present risk. It called for collective vigilance, shared resources, and the kind of industry-wide communication about threats that the sector had historically been too competitive and too siloed to sustain. It did not mention Michael by name. It did not need to. By 9 p.m., it had been read by every significant technology journalist in the country. By 10 p.m., it was being discussed on 3 financial news networks. By midnight, Evelyn Vance's name was attached to a story that was no longer about a cheating husband and a betrayed wife in a Silicon Valley mansion. It was about a CEO who had discovered a federal crime, built an airtight case, reported it to authorities, protected her company, and then turned around and used the moment to call her entire industry to a higher standard. It was the story of a woman who had been operated on from the inside by someone she trusted and had not fallen, not even slightly. At 11:47 p.m., Michael Thorne, lying on the same hotel bed he had been lying on for most of the day, watched Evelyn's statement being read aloud on the television news channel he had left running for background noise. He watched the anchor describe Evelyn as someone who had handled an extraordinary personal and professional crisis with remarkable discipline and clarity. He watched clips of the statement on the screen, her words in someone else's voice, her message reaching across a national broadcast into a hotel room in Palo Alto, where he lay with his shoes still on and his jacket still pocketing the code to a safe that held a hard drive full of the worst decisions of his life. He turned off the television. The room was dark. He thought about Pebble Beach, about Derek Calloway and the easy conversation over drinks and the way it had felt to be identified, approached, told that he was valuable, that he had access worth wanting, that someone saw what he could offer. He had been so hungry for that. He had not understood until now in this dark hotel room how hungry he had actually been, how deeply he had needed to matter on his own terms, in his own right, separate from Evelyn's shadow and Evelyn's money and Evelyn's achievement, how that hunger had made him the easiest possible target for a man like Calloway. He had thought he was the one running the game. He had been a piece on someone else's board from the very beginning. He closed his eyes. He thought about Monday morning, about Raymond's calm voice telling him to walk in cooperative, to offer everything he knew, to make himself useful enough that the word manageable might apply to what came next. He thought about the words 10 to 15 years. He thought about Evelyn standing at the bottom of the stairs in her own house, completely still saying, "You are trespassing in my property," without a single tremor in her voice. He thought she knew exactly what she was doing. She always did. And for the first time since he had walked out that door, maybe for the first time in 7 years, Michael Thorne stopped arguing with that truth. He just lay there in the dark and let it be true. Outside the hotel window, the Saturday night of Palo Alto moved on without him, as the world had always moved on without him, as it would continue to do. Cars passed. Music played somewhere distant. People made choices that had nothing to do with his, and lived lives that did not require him to exist. He had spent his entire life trying to attach himself to things that would make him matter. In the morning, he was going to have to figure out who he was when everything he had attached himself to was gone. It was the first honest problem he had faced in a very long time. Sunday came quietly. Evelyn had slept 4 hours, not because she couldn't sleep longer, but because at 5:47 a.m., her body simply decided it was finished, and she opened her eyes with the specific alertness of someone whose mind had been working even while the rest of her rested. She lay still for a moment in the dark of the master bedroom, her bedroom in her house in a life that was fully and completely hers, in a way it had not felt for a very long time, and she took 3 slow breaths, and then she got up. Sandra had gone home at 1 a.m. after extracting a promise that Evelyn would actually sleep. Thomas had left an hour before that. James Carver was in the guest house available, but not intrusive the way he always was. The house itself was still in the way that large houses are still at dawn, not empty exactly, but resting. She made coffee. She stood at the kitchen island and she read in silence the full coverage that had accumulated overnight. There were 14 major articles, 7 broadcast segments available online, a thread on a technology forum that had reached several thousand replies, 2 op-eds, one in a financial publication and one in a general interest outlet that had been written and published while she slept. The coverage was almost uniformly exactly what Thomas had aimed for. The framing held. Ether AI was the protagonist. The investigation was the action. Evelyn was the architect of the response, not the victim of the inciting event. One headline read, Ether AI CEO turns betrayal into federal case and industry wake-up call. Another read how Evelyn Vance built the case that brought down a corporate espionage ring. She read them carefully, not for the flattery. She was too precise a person to be moved by flattery, but for what they revealed about how the story had landed in the public mind. She was looking for gaps for framings that needed correcting for any thread she would need Thomas to address before the week began. She found very few. At 7:30 a.m. her phone rang. The name on the screen was one she had not expected on a Sunday morning, Victor Hale, the chairman of Ether AI's board of directors. She answered. Victor, she said. Evelyn. His voice was warm in the way of very powerful men who have decided to be warm at you, which was different from warmth as such, but she had learned to work within it. I want you to know that the board met informally last night, by phone, all 7 of us. I'm aware that was likely, she said. We want you to know unanimously that the board's confidence in your leadership is unchanged. If anything, he paused as though choosing the next word with care, clarified. Thank you, Victor. The merger, he said. The Axiom deal. There's been concern since the news broke about whether the timeline is unchanged, Evelyn said. The due diligence is clean. The IP challenge we're filing Monday will strengthen, not weaken our patent position. I'll have a full briefing ready for the board by Wednesday. A brief silence. You're already 3 steps ahead of where I thought this conversation was going, Victor said. I usually am, Evelyn said. He laughed. It was genuine, she thought. Wednesday, then. She hung up and finished her coffee. At 9:15 a.m., she called Janet Okafor. Janet answered on this first ring. She sounded like someone who had also slept approximately 4 hours. Good morning. Good morning, Evelyn said. I saw that Apex Neural put out a statement last night. We did, thanks to having 6 hours of warning instead of being blindsided by a press call. Janet's voice was steady, but underneath the steadiness there was something raw. Our internal contact resigned this morning before we could address it formally. Who was it? Evelyn asked. My head of partnerships. A pause. I hired him 18 months ago. I thought he was one of our best people. Her voice tightened. He had access to everything. Our investor pipeline, our technical roadmap, our hiring plans. I'm sorry, Evelyn said, and she meant it specifically and completely in the way you can only mean something when you understand from the inside what it costs. How did you keep working? Janet asked. After you knew. For 6 weeks you knew and you kept... I converted it, Evelyn said. The anger. I took it and I made it useful. Every morning I woke up and I thought about what needed to be built that day, and I built it. She paused. It didn't feel heroic. It felt like the only thing that made sense to do. Janet was quiet for a moment. I want to propose something to you, and I want you to tell me honestly if it's the wrong time to be proposing things. It's never the wrong time to build something, Evelyn said. There are 5 of us, Janet said. 5 companies that Callaway's network targeted. 5 founders who now understand in a very specific way how this kind of attack happens, what it looks like, and how to document it. And there are hundreds of other technology companies, smaller ones, earlier stage ones, companies that don't have the resources you had, the investigative connections, the legal infrastructure. They wouldn't know what to look for, Evelyn said. And even if they found it, they wouldn't know what to do with it, Janet said. But we do, now. Evelyn put her coffee cup down. You want to build something, she said. I want to build something, Janet confirmed. An information sharing network, a rapid response resource, something that makes what you built, the detection, the documentation, the legal process, accessible to founders who don't have your particular set of advantages. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of the specific generative energy of 2 precise minds arriving at the same shape from different directions. Come to Atherton, Evelyn said. This week. Bring whoever you need. We'll map it properly. Tuesday, Janet said. Tuesday, Evelyn agreed. She hung up and stood in her kitchen and felt for the first time since she had found that hotel receipt in a jacket pocket 7 weeks ago, something that was not anger, not grief, not the cold, focused energy of a woman at war with a situation she had not chosen. She felt interested in what came next. That was the thing about Evelyn Vance that Michael had never understood, had never been capable of understanding, because understanding it would have required a quality of imagination he simply did not possess. She was not a person who was defined by what she had. She was a person who was defined by what she built, and the building never stopped. It adapted, it redirected, it changed form when the situation required, but it never stopped. He had tried to take from her something that could not ultimately be taken, because the thing that made Ether AI what it was, the thing that made Evelyn Vance who she was not in the files Michael had handed to Callaway. It was not in the roadmap documents or the architectural data or the $900 million of prior research. It was in the 12 hours she had already put in since midnight. It was in the phone call to Janet Okafor at 9:15 on a Sunday morning. It was in the specific, unstoppable quality of her attention that could not be transferred. It could not be stolen. It could not be accessed by a prepaid tablet purchased with cash in Fresno. Michael Thorne had spent 9 months handing Derek Callaway pieces of a picture, and what he had never understood was that the picture was not the painting. The painting was still in Evelyn. At 10:03 a.m. on Monday morning, Michael Thorne walked into the San Jose field office of the FBI with Raymond Chu beside him. He was wearing a jacket that was slightly wrong for the occasion, too casual, the jacket of a man who had packed in 30 minutes on a Friday night, and he carried nothing except his phone, which Raymond had told him to keep off, and his own history, which he could not put down regardless of what Raymond advised. Agent Haynes was professional, thorough, and entirely without warmth, which was appropriate. He had a colleague with him, a younger agent whose name Michael did not retain, and a recording device on the table between them, and a folder that was thicker than Michael had expected, which told him before a single question was asked that they already knew more than he had hoped. Raymond had prepared him. Raymond had spent 3 hours on Sunday walking Michael through the likely structure of the interview, the questions they would ask, the sequence they would use, the points at which Michael should answer directly, and the points at which Raymond would interject. Michael answered directly. He gave them Callaway's contact information, all 3 numbers, 2 of which he had memorized from the prepaid device before surrendering it to Raymond. He described the structure of the communications. He described the 4 meetings in person, Pebble Beach, twice in San Francisco, once in a parking structure in Mountain View. He described the payment arrangement, the Cayman account, the transfer schedule, the intermediary who had set it up on Callaway's behalf. He described the documents. He listed them as specifically as he could from memory, acknowledging that his memory was imperfect, but that he was offering everything he had. He answered for 2 hours and 40 minutes. At the end, Haynes closed his folder and looked at Michael with the carefully neutral expression of a man who has heard a great deal and has decided to reveal nothing in response. "Mr. Thorne," he said, "I want to be transparent with you about where we are. Based on what you've provided today, in combination with what we've already assembled, we have a substantially complete picture of the cybernetics operation. Your cooperation is noted and will be communicated to the U.S. Attorney's Office." "What does that mean practically?" Raymond asked. It means the conversation about charges and exposure continues, Haynes said. It means Mr. Thorne's cooperation is a meaningful data point in that conversation. I can't give you numbers today. Raymond nodded. This was what he had expected. Michael sat across the table from Agent Haynes and understood with the particular resignation of a man who has reached the end of what he can control that this was where his agency ended. He had given everything he could give. He had cooperated as fully as he was capable of cooperating. What happened next was not in his hands. He thought briefly about the hard drive in the hotel safe which he had surrendered to Raymond that morning, who had surrendered it to Haynes at the beginning of the meeting, who had accepted it with the practiced neutrality of someone receiving exactly what he expected. Michael had not accessed it. He had done that one thing correctly. He did not know if it would matter. He suspected it would matter less than he hoped, and more than he feared, which was the shape of most things he was beginning to understand. He stood up when the meeting ended, shook hands with Haynes because Raymond had told him to, and because it was the right thing to do, and walked out of the building into the Monday morning sunshine of San Jose. He stood on the sidewalk. Raymond stood beside him. Now what? Michael said. Now, Raymond said, we wait. Michael looked at the street, at the people moving past him with the ordinary momentum of a Monday going to work, coming from somewhere living lives that did not include the inside of a federal interview room or a hotel safe or a prepaid tablet purchased with cash in Fresno. I need to find somewhere to live, Michael said. Yes, Raymond said. I need to figure out employment. I haven't worked for anyone except in Evelyn's orbit for 7 years. My resume is... He stopped. He shook his head slowly. I don't even know what I'd put on a resume. Raymond looked at him for a moment. Michael, those are real problems and they deserve real attention. But right now, today, the only problem you need to solve is not doing anything that makes your situation worse. I've been doing that for 9 months, Michael said, making it worse. Then stop today, Raymond said. That's all. Just stop today. He called a car and left. Michael stood on the sidewalk alone for a moment. Then he started walking. He didn't have a destination. He just walked, because the forward motion of it felt like the only honest thing available to him. Not progress exactly, not purpose, but at least the physical fact of moving through the world without performing anything for anyone. He thought about Raymond's question from Sunday night. Who are you when everything you attached yourself to is gone? He didn't have an answer yet, but for the first time in a very long time, the question felt like his own. On Wednesday morning, Janet Okafor arrived at the Atherton house with 2 members of her team and a legal pad full of structural notes for what she had already started calling informally the Clearwater Initiative, a name she had arrived at by herself, and that Evelyn, when she heard it, immediately liked. They worked for 6 hours. What they built across the kitchen table, that had seen so much in the past 5 days, was the framework for something that had not existed before: a private membership-based information-sharing network for technology company founders focused specifically on the detection and documentation of internal security threats, corporate espionage, and the kind of sophisticated social engineering that Callaway's operation had used to recruit assets across 5 separate companies. It was not a regulatory body. It was not a law enforcement collaboration. It was something older and more fundamental than either: a community of people who had been through something and had decided that the lesson belonged to everyone, not just to them. By 4 p.m., they had a working document. By 6 p.m., they had a list of 12 additional founders across the Bay Area and Seattle and Austin, who Janet's team had identified as likely early members. By 7 p.m., Evelyn had called 4 of them personally. All 4 said yes before she finished explaining the concept. Sandra Park, who had been sitting at the far end of the table working in parallel on the patent filings, looked up at some point in the late afternoon and said to no one in particular, "You realize this is going to be a bigger deal than the Axiom merger." Evelyn looked at her across the table. "The Axiom merger closes Friday," Evelyn said. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves." Sandra smiled. "You're already ahead of yourself. You've been ahead of yourself since Saturday morning." Janet laughed a real laugh, the first genuinely unguarded sound Evelyn had heard from her since she arrived, and the room felt briefly like something other than a war room, like the beginning of something. The Axiom merger closed on Friday as scheduled. It was a $4.2 billion transaction that had been in negotiation for 8 months, that had survived due diligence, that had survived the news cycle of the past week, and that closed on a Friday afternoon in a conference room in San Francisco with 11 lawyers and 2 CEOs, and a handshake that was also a signature on 17 separate documents. Evelyn signed last with the same pen she always used for significant documents, a simple, unremarkable ballpoint that she had bought at a drugstore years ago because she did not believe in ceremonial objects. What mattered was what the pen recorded, not the pen itself. When it was done, the Axiom CEO, a careful, technically brilliant man named Raj Subramaniam, who had been navigating this negotiation with Evelyn for most of a year, looked at her across the conference table and said, "I want to say something." "Go ahead," Evelyn said. When the news broke last week, he said, "My board asked me whether we should pause, whether the situation at Ether AI represented a risk to the transaction." He paused. "I told them no. I told them that what Evelyn Vance had just demonstrated was exactly why we wanted to merge with her company and not someone else's." Evelyn looked at him. "I told them," he continued, "that a CEO who can discover that level of threat, build that level of case, report it to federal authorities, manage the disclosure, and close a $4 billion merger in the same week is exactly the kind of leader this combined company needs." She did not thank him for this. She was not built for that kind of gratitude, the kind that requires you to receive something and hold it and show that you have been touched by it. Instead, she said, "Then let's make sure we don't waste what we built." Raj smiled. "Agreed." They shook hands again. The arrest came the following Tuesday. Derek Calloway was taken into federal custody at 7:14 a.m. outside his home in Menlo Park. 3 other executives from Cybernetics Group were arrested in coordinated actions across the Bay Area within the same 90-minute window. The coordinated nature of it, the simultaneous multi-location execution of warrants that had been prepared and held until the full scope of the operation was mapped, was Agent Haynes told Evelyn in a brief call that morning, the result of the additional intelligence provided by Michael's Monday interview. Michael had in the end been useful. "And Michael himself?" Evelyn asked. "Charges are being filed today," Haynes said. "The U.S. Attorney's Office has taken the cooperation into account. The exposure has been reduced significantly from the initial range." "How significantly?" "I'm not at liberty to—" "Robert," she said. She had begun calling him Robert somewhere in the middle of the previous week, when the formality of titles had started to feel like a performance neither of them needed. "How significantly?" A brief pause. "He's looking at 18 to 24 months, with good behavior." "I understand," she said. She sat with that for a moment. 18 to 24 months. Not 10 years. Not 15. A number that was real and serious and consequential, and also she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge this shorter than what he had deserved by several measures. But it was not her calculation to make. She had given Haynes the information. She had done her part. The justice system had done its math. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." "Ms. Vance," Haynes said, "I've been doing this for 16 years. In terms of the quality and completeness of a private evidence package, what you and Patricia Solis built is genuinely one of the most impressive things I've encountered. You gave us everything we needed to make this case." She thanked him again and hung up. She sat at her desk for a long moment. She thought about Michael. Not with anger. She had converted, all of that had spent it in the purposeful direction it needed to go. And what was left on the other side of that conversion was something quieter and more complicated. Not forgiveness exactly. Forgiveness was a long road, and she was at the beginning of it, not the end. But something like understanding. The understanding of a person who has looked at another person's hunger and recognized it as real, even while holding them fully accountable for what they did with it. She thought about the man she had thought she was marrying, about whether any version of that man had ever existed, or whether the performance had been so complete from the beginning that there was no real Michael underneath it, only the varying costumes of what he needed to be for whomever he was standing in front of. She didn't know the answer to that. She suspected she never would. What she knew was this: she had given 7 years to someone who had given her theater, And the 7 years were real, and the theater was also real, and both of those things were true simultaneously, and she was going to have to hold them both for a long time before either one resolved into something she could set down. But she was not broken. She had looked in this past 10 days for the crack she expected to find, the place where the grief and the betrayal and the sheer exhausted weight of having been wrong about someone for so long had fractured something structural. She had looked for it with the same precision she looked for everything, which meant she found what was actually there rather than what she was afraid of. What she found was not a crack. What she found was a woman who had been tested at the deepest level, not just professionally, not just legally, but personally, in the marrow of her trust, and had not bent. Had in fact, in the 10 days since she had driven home from a hotel parking structure at 11 p.m. on a Friday night, built a federal case, closed a $4 billion merger, launched the structural framework of an industry-wide security initiative, and made herself available to 4 other founders trying to navigate the same terrain, had gotten up every morning and converted. She thought about something Sandra had said Thursday afternoon when they were finally genuinely finished with the most urgent layer of crisis work, and sitting in the quiet of the office with cold coffee and the specific, worn, clean feeling of people who have been running at capacity for too long. Sandra had said very simply, "You're different than you were 6 months ago." Evelyn had looked at her. "Different how?" "Harder," Sandra said, "but not in a bad way, more certain. Like you know exactly what you're made of now." Evelyn had thought about that for a moment. "I suppose I do," she had said. The gala was Janet's idea. It was not called a gala. Officially, it was a founding dinner for the Clearwater Initiative, a private gathering of the 19 founders who had committed to the first cohort of the network, held at the Atherton House on a Saturday evening, 3 weeks after the night that had changed everything. But it was in practice something more than a dinner. It was a declaration, a visible, public-facing statement that the 5 companies that had been targeted were not diminished by what had been done to them, were, if anything, more connected, more organized, more intentional about what they were building together. Evelyn wore something simple and dark and exactly right, in the way that people who have genuine authority never need to perform it with their clothes. She stood in the front room of her house with Vance. Heritage Holdings LLC on the deed, and no one else's name anywhere in the chain of title, and she spoke briefly without notes to the 19 people gathered there. She thanked them for being there. She described in simple terms what the Clearwater Initiative was built to do. She talked about the industry they were all operating in, the specific risks that came with building in a space where the most valuable thing you owned lived in the minds of your team and the architecture of your systems, and where trust was a necessary vulnerability rather than an optional one. And then she said something that was not in any statement Thomas had drafted, that she had not planned to say, that arrived fully formed in the moment and was simply exactly true. She said, "The past month taught me that the most dangerous thing you can be is underestimated. Not because being underestimated feels bad, it doesn't, not if you're paying attention. But because when people underestimate you, they become careless. They show you who they are. They stop hiding. And if you're watching closely enough, if you've done the work of building the right systems, the right relationships, the right documentation, you see everything." She paused. "So let them underestimate you," she said. "Let them think they know the full shape of what you're capable of. Let them believe that the life they see from the outside is the whole picture." She looked at the room, 19 people, every one of them, someone who had been through something and had come out still standing. "It never is." The room was quiet for a moment. Then Janet started to applaud, and the others followed, and the sound of it filled the house that Evelyn Vance had bought under another name, in an entity that protected her assets with the specific precision of a woman who had never trusted blindly and never would, the house that had been a trap for a man who thought he owned it and a fortress for the woman who actually did. 18 months later, Michael Thorne served 11 months of a 20-month sentence at a federal correctional facility in Northern California. The reduction from 24 to 20 months reflected his cooperation. The further reduction to 11 served reflected good behavior participation in a rehabilitation program, and the quiet, unremarked fact that by any objective measure the prison system had received a man who was not dangerous, only hungry, and had always been far better at performing strength than actually possessing it. He was released on a Tuesday morning in October into a world that had moved on from his story the way the world always moves on completely and without looking back. He had no legal claim to the Atherton house. He had no access to the offshore account which had been seized and partially applied to restitution. He had the watch his father had left him. He had 11 months of reflection that had produced, if not wisdom, then at least the beginning of honesty. He did not contact Evelyn. He understood finally that there was nothing to say that she needed to hear. Clara Simmons had moved to Portland 6 weeks after that Friday night and was building something new, a life that was genuinely hers, chosen by her with no borrowed mansion and no borrowed narrative. She did not think about Michael often. When she did, it was not with anger. It was with the particular humbling clarity of someone who has seen themselves clearly in a difficult moment and decided to become someone else. That is its own kind of courage. Ether AI merged with Axiom, and operating under the combined structure that Evelyn and Raj Subramaniam had built was valued at $11 billion by the end of that fiscal year. The Clearwater Initiative had grown to 47 member companies across 6 states. The patent challenge against cybernetics had been resolved in Ether AI's favor in a ruling that established a significant precedent for the protection of proprietary AI architecture. And Evelyn Vance stood at her desk on a Thursday morning in November, coffee in hand light, coming through the windows of the house that had always been hers, reading a briefing document that Sandra had prepared for the next board meeting. And she felt the same thing she felt every morning, the pull of what was next. The forward motion of a mind that did not rest the particular and irreplaceable satisfaction of someone who builds things and knows it. Not because someone gave her the right, not because someone stood beside her and made her possible, but because she had always known exactly what she was made of, and she had never not once needed anyone's permission to prove it.